All right, good afternoon, folks. Hope everybody's doing okay this afternoon. All right. So, want to remind you of the assignments that are due before Sunday. There is a quiz and a short answer questions. I forget how many questions I put up there. Short answer assignments usually only have a couple of questions. And those are both due Sunday before midnight. Next week's quiz and short answer question will be posted on Monday next week. So you'll have a whole week to work on these. So one of the first things that I want to emphasize every time I teach this class, and you'll hear me say this over and over and over, birds should see an avian vet, a specialist, someone who has studied birds, knows how to handle birds, knows how to treat birds. As we go through this, you'll see that birds have different anatomy and physiology. Physiology is just how the body works. The anatomy is the structures, the physiology is the functions. So because their anatomy is different and their physiology is different, they respond differently to drugs. They get different diseases than dogs and cats, and even things that would be relatively simple, like giving them an injection. You can't just pull up loose skin on the scruff of their neck. That's not how you give a bird an injection. So speaking of furry mammals, I don't know if you can hear the cat meowing in the background. So they do need to see a specialist here. So the first thing is, what's a bird? I mean, we all kind of have an idea of what a bird is. We got an idea that it's something that flies and it has feathers. But we need to really define it, because not all birds fly. And feathers on some species of birds don't look like what you're thinking of when you think of feathers. So I'm going to give you some terms here that we use to define bird, and then we're going to walk through all these terms and I'm going to explain them. So birds are endothermic, tetrapods. They are vertebrate animals. They have feathers and a beak. They have an absence of teeth, i.e., no teeth. And they lay hard shell eggs. So that's a complex and encompassing definition. And you probably know what some of these words mean, and you might not know what all of them. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you don't know, for example, endothermic. So I'm going to give you guys a few seconds to write those down. And another thank you for the people who have their cameras on. As I can see, you're still writing. Really helps me to pace myself.
I feel like I'm already missing something.
Okay. Do you want to elaborate on that?
I just got here like
Okay. The words on the screen are the terms we're using to describe what is a bird.
yeah, I didn't really I didn't really like have any introduction. It just kind of like started.
Did you come in a few minutes late?
I don't think so. I came in at like 3:02 maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, we started a little, I tend to start right on time. So yeah, you did kind of miss the announcements and stuff. This does get posted to YouTube, so you can always go onto YouTube and watch the first 3 or 4 minutes and catch up on what you've missed. Okay, so let's kind of work through some of these definitions. I normally, and I don't think I've done that with you guys, but I always like to ask avian science classes to define animal, because you're animal science people, right? You're studying animals. And it's always funny to me how challenging defining an animal can be, even to people who are studying animals. So this is a simple definition of animal. Any living organism that has more than one cell and is capable of independent movement. Now, if you go into biology, there's a lot more involved here, but this is narrowing it down to the simplest definition. If you see something that has more than one cell and it's moving around on its own, it's an animal. So animal includes birds. It includes reptiles, but it also includes things like insects and snails and all kinds of little critters that crawl around on the ground. That a lot of people who are like, oh yes, I'm an animal lover, but what they mean is I love mammals. So you've got to include the bees and the wasps and the millipedes and the crabs and all of that stuff in the definition of animal. We also said that birds were vertebrates. That means that there's an internal skeleton made of either bone or cartilage. So we have an internal skeleton of bone. Birds do, fish, reptiles, amphibians, all of us have that internal skeleton. Cartilage is just it's similar to bone, but it's a little bit flexible. It's not as stiff. We have cartilage, for example, on the end of our nose that allows, you can grab your nose and wiggle it. Our ears, the external ear is made of cartilage. So birds have an internal skeleton as well. Tetrapod. Tetra means 4. And pod means foot. So tetrapod, when we're talking in biology, we include everything that has 4 limbs. It doesn't have to be feet specifically. So it can be legs, it can be arms, it can be wings. Just that we have 4 appendages sticking off of our core body. And of course, birds have 2 legs and 2 wings, but that counts. You guys are quiet. I'm not used to avian classes being quiet. Usually you guys all know each other already. I said that birds were endothermic. Endo means inside, and of course, thermic refers to temperature. A lot of people will use the term warm-blooded here. Warm-blooded is kind of the non-scientific way of saying this, but endothermic means that they're capable of maintaining a relatively constant internal body temperature. That relatively is important. So all endothermic animals' body temperature goes up and down through the day. Our body temperature does this. Some parts of the day you'll have a lower body temperature than other parts of the day. And we say that humans have a body temperature of 98.6. That's just an average. You can, if your body temperature is 97.3, you're fine. You know, if you go to the doctor and they find it's 99.0, that's fine. Same thing with birds, except of course, their body temperature is much higher. So birds tend to have a body temperature somewhere between 101 and 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Some birds, like hummingbirds especially, go into a resting state that's called torpor. Torpor is almost like a miniature hibernation. Their body temperature will go down, heart rate will go down. They don't need as much energy. Hummingbirds need constant input of calories because they have a very, very fast metabolism. Their heart beats fast, they move a lot. So if they weren't able to go into torpor, they'd have to feed all night long. So they go into this state at night to reduce their food needs so they can get some rest. Other species of birds will do this in the wintertime or during rest stops during migration season, just to reduce their energy needs so they don't have to feed as often. That makes sense to everybody? Okay, good. There we go. Now the chat's going. All right, birds have feathers. This picture on the left is kind of what you expect when you think of feathers. They are, hang on a second, I forgot to grab my feathers. They are relatively soft, so a little bit flexible. The shaft portion in the center is hollow. So if you cut off the tip, that's how they were able to use these sorts of things as writing utensils, because they could put ink inside the shaft. Now, not all feathers look like this. You can see in this other picture, there's a downy feather. Downy feathers have a much looser structure. They're kind of fluffy and flexible. And I've got trouble coming up here, wanting to look at the feathers, so I may have to put them up pretty quick. Sometimes they're ornamental and they're brightly colored, but not always. Hi. Yes, you're in the way. We'll talk about feathers in more detail in a couple of lectures, but one of the things we'll learn is that tail feathers, the shaft is straight. Flight feathers, the shaft will be curved. And we'll talk about why that's important when we talk about feathers in more detail. And I know you guys can't see it, but my cat's on the desk. Loves the feathers, wants to play with them. Ha. Also loves to go in the closet. Ah, I see somebody said they used to make quills and it's a very specific cut. That makes sense. I can tell that it's not as simple as taking a pair of scissors. All right. Now, some feathers, like the downy feathers, are for insulation to keep the bird warm, and others are, they're for flight. But not everything with feathers flies. So here's a nice ostrich. Thank goodness they don't fly. They're really big. And their feathers are going to look different. And flying doesn't make a bird. There are mammals and insects that fly, like the bat and the dragonfly here. There's a lot of things that fly. Depending on how flexible you are with your definition of flight, there are also snakes and lizards and frogs and fish that all fly, and squid. Goodness gracious, the more I think about it, the more I think of how many things fly in some way. I mentioned that birds have beaks, but no teeth. So one of the questions I often get at this point is beak versus bill. Scientifically speaking, there's no difference. You can use either term. Some people like to use beak for a pointed beak and bill for the more rounded beak of ducks and geese. That's fine, but it's not required. You can use those terms interchangeably. The beak is made of bone. So inside that there's bone, and it's covered with specialized skin. So the surface is actually skin. And there are no teeth. So if we look at Sassy here, she's taxidermied. She's got a covering over the beak. I know you guys can't feel it, unfortunately, but there's bone inside of that. You're not actually looking at the bone. You're looking at the preserved skin there. And say hello to Sassy. You'll see a lot of her this semester. Now, the teeth thing is interesting. Birds have the genes needed to make teeth. They're just turned off. And sometimes there are mutations that can cause birds to have, they're not teeth like our teeth. They're not that well defined and constructed, but they can have a primitive form of teeth if they have these genetic mutations. Pretty weird. Now, when we look at beaks, the shape of the beak will tell you a lot about what the bird eats. And again, this is something we'll go into in more detail later on. But anytime you see a long hook at the end of a beak, that is a sign that the bird eats something that it needs to tear open or that's very slippery. So meat and fish eaters tend to have hooked beaks. You'll also see this on parrots because they have to, pry open nuts and seeds. Is the inner part of the beak somewhat serrated? Yes, on some species. Don't know if you guys can see it on Sassy on camera here. See if I can, the lower edge here, I don't know if you guys can see that. Does have some serrations there. Probably the best thing to do would be to close this so that I'm bigger. So you can kind of see it on the underside of the backside here. You see those lines there. So that's serrations on there. Okay. And omnivores. Good question. One sec. There are certainly birds that are very flexible in their diets. I don't really see a good example here, but generally speaking, if a bird eats fish or meat, they're going to be pretty specialized to eat those, and they're not going to eat seeds in addition to that. So the omnivores tend to be the small songbirds that have a beak more like this sparrow here. And those guys will eat a lot of seeds and insects in addition to that. So that serrated part of the bill, they're not teeth the way we have teeth. They're not constructed the same. They are, and they're not really used the same. They're used to ducks and flamingos and geese will take in water that's got food in it, vegetation, small fish, insects that live in the water, And they use that serration on the side, kind of like a sieve. So the water can come out, but they can keep in whatever the food is. So that's what the serrations there are for. They're not for chewing the way teeth are for chewing. Birds that eat stuff that birds don't chew. They don't chew their food. If you're a bird and you're a meat eater or a fish eater, you either swallow your food whole or you tear pieces off and swallow the pieces. It's really impressive. If you've ever, do you know what a great blue heron is? Let me, I got a lot of yeses. So that's probably everybody. Let's go take a look anyway. So I'm going to turn off the audio here. This is a great blue heron. I mean, look at the size of that fish it's got. Huge fish. And it's going to swallow it whole. It's going to take him a while. But I mean, isn't that amazing? And down it goes. Like a snake, yeah. Okay. All right. The next thing in our bird definition is a hard-shelled egg. So the eggs have a hard calcium shell. Everybody has seen eggs, you know, chicken eggs. That's a great example. They're probably in half of our refrigerators. It's different than the eggs of reptiles. The eggs of reptiles tend to be leathery and have a little bit of flexibility to them. Bird eggs do not. The inside portion of the egg is very, very similar to what you would see inside a reptile egg. So when you crack open an egg, there's a yolk, the yellow part. That is the material that would go to feed the baby chick. And then there's the white part. The white part is actually made up of a series of membranes and a lot of fluid, which are important for hydration of the developing chick, as well as collecting waste and oxygen exchange. So the baby inside the egg can get oxygen through the eggshell through one of those membranes that'll be right up against the very inside of the egg. And you see the same things in reptiles. So that's kind of our definition of a bird. And you may have noticed I compared them to reptiles, especially with the egg stuff. Well, it turns out, you know, this is going to drive me crazy. Hang on a second. forgot to adjust all of these images for Zoom instead of in person. So let me adjust a couple of these. Oops. Hang on just a second. Have some patience with me here. There we go. All right. Okay, there we go. Well, when we look at birds and herpetology, it turns out that amphibians are not very closely related to reptiles. This is a family tree, basically. So amphibians are way over here by themselves. Mammals, birds, and reptiles, these are closer related. And in fact, birds and reptiles are more closely related to each other. This is a common ancestor. So say that's the grandparents. This would be great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. So you can kind of see mammals are less related to either birds or reptiles than birds and reptiles are to each other. So as you can see, herpetology is a silly field. Reptiles are actually more closely related to birds and mammals than to amphibians. It should really be broken up with lizards folded into ornithology. Ornithology, of course, the study of birds. The herpetologist response, as you can see, ornithologists are actually assholes. So, yes, birds and reptiles more closely related to each other. It's of course more complicated than that. It's biology. It always is more complicated than that. So when we talk about birds, you guys have probably heard this. It's something that's really come up in the past decade or so. Birds are kind of dinosaurs. They're dinosaurs that live now rather than millions of years ago. If you look at this cartoon, a lot of these animals are portrayed as dinosaurs, right? Dimetrodon is often listed as a dinosaur, Pteranodon, Plesiosaurs. None of those are dinosaurs, only the cockatiel. And we know this in part because of some genetic work and a lot of fossils that we found. And we find fossils of dinosaurs that have feathers. This image on the upper right, this is a part of a tail of a dinosaur, millions of years old, that clearly shows feathers. And this isn't always easy to see, but this is a fossil of a dinosaur. If you looked, you'd see teeth in here, but you can see the neck had feathers on it. These are feathers coming off. And there's an imprint. Like I said, I apologize, it's not easy to see, but they are clear, obvious, long flight feathers here, and there are feathers along the tail as well. My notes say this piece of amber, 99 million years old. So when we look at the tetrapod, well, I guess this is all post-amphibian. So amphibians aren't on this, but reptiles, birds, mammals are all on this family tree. This is a common ancestor between the group that we call reptiles and the group that became mammals. You don't have to know these fancy words in here. So mammals are less related to any of these other groups than they are to each other. But when we look at the reptiles, the turtle is over here kind of by itself. There's a dashed line because there's a lot of disagreement about where turtles fit on the family tree and what they're related to, but they're not very related to any of the other lizards. When we look at the other reptiles, we see lizards and snakes down here kind of by themselves. And then we have a group that's called the archosaurs. The archosaurs include the dinosaurs and the crocodiles. And the dinosaur group includes the birds. So, of the animals that are living today, the closest relative to the bird are the crocodiles. Crocodiles are not closely related to lizards at all, even though they look like it. I love this fact. This is a fun one. So I'm going to talk briefly about crocodiles in relation to birds. Crocodiles does include alligators, by the way. So they're egg laying. Yeah, so are lizards, but they lay their eggs in nests and they have a lot of parental care. So the mother guards the nest and she protects the offspring. She provides food for the offspring. Turtles, they tend to lay their eggs and walk away. Lizards and snakes, there's a lot of diversity and there is some parental care, but not usually as much as you see from the crocodiles or the birds. And then there is some anatomical characteristic. So if you look at the heart of a crocodile, it's a four-chambered heart, like our heart is a four-chambered heart. And so are birds. Lizards and snakes and turtles, not so much. They have 3 chambers in their heart. So it's a different anatomy. And when we look at the feet, this is an alligator here, long toes, scaly. This is a bird. This is a cassowary foot. He's not awake. It might be a necropsy picture, I'm not sure. But you can see the similarity. There's all this scaly skin. It looks a lot like the alligator skin here. Long, long claws. Cassowary is a bird you do not want to mess with. These claws can do some damage. Okay. What do you want me to elaborate on or talk more about? Mary, your hand's up. Go ahead.
How about the endothermic?
You want me to go through that again?
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, no problem. So endothermic is maintaining constant body temperature, higher than the air or water. also called warm-blooded. So when we think about mammals and birds, their body temperature is going to be higher than the temperature of the air around them. But if we're talking about, if you think about lizards, their body temperature tends to be just about the same as the air temperature. So warm-blooded allows a more active lifestyle. Your body's, your cells function best at a certain temperature. And so when your body is colder than that temperature or warmer than that temperature, it's not going to function as well. It also, oh, hello. Go away. It also allows activity in cold weather. You don't see lizards. Well, you don't see lizards in Massachusetts, but you certainly don't see them in the winter, but you see birds. That's because they can maintain that body temperature. Does that clear things up a little bit? Okay, good. Anybody else want to chime in with something I can go over again?
Could we go back to the first slide?
Sure.
I just missed the notes on that.
This one, the announcements,
No,
this one, where I had all the stuff written here.
vertebrae.
Yeah, so I defined birds as endothermic, tetrapod, vertebrate animals with feathers and a beak, no teeth, and they lay hard shelled eggs. Is that what you were looking for?
Yes.
So that was all the stuff that we've been going through. And while you're writing it down, this is an ostrich egg. This is an emu egg. You can see how big these guys get. If you look on, yeah, it would be a huge omelet. If you look on Blackboard and see that picture of me with the big skeleton behind me, that bird's egg makes this one look small. Fortunately for us, they're not around. Well, I would say unfortunately, because I'd love to see them, but they're not around anymore. Okay. Can birds' feet tell you how their body temperature is? Actually, that is a good question, Rosalie. If you think about dogs and cats, you feel their paws, that can often tell you if they have a fever. That is not the case with birds. Their feet are not going to give you an accurate idea of what their body temperature is. And if you think about their lives in the wild, their feet are always sticking out, right? They don't have feathers or fur to keep their feet warm. They're just out there in the cold. So they have modifications in their legs that reduce blood flow to their feet when it's cold outside. So their feet can be a lot colder than their body. So yeah, it's not a good way to judge their temperature. You kind of got to stick a thermometer in there. Okay. Oh, that's not what I was going to do. Let's go to the whiteboard. Their body temperature is taken the same way you would take a dog or a cat's body temperature. You stick a thermometer. They don't have the same anatomy that mammals do, but there is an opening for egg laying and feces coming out, and you stick a thermometer in there. That's how you take their temperature. Nothing fancy. All right. I want to talk about a lot of the legal aspects of working with birds. I copied my notes and they are on Blackboard. So what I am going over is all on Blackboard. It's an outline format, but all the information is there because this is pretty intense. There's a lot of detail here. So we're going to start with the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And I'm going to read you a description of this act. This is true for the United States. The MBTA provides that it is unlawful to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, possess, sell, purchase, barter, import, export, or transport any migratory bird or any part, nest, or egg of any such bird unless authorized under a permit issued by the Secretary of the Interior. Some regulatory exceptions apply. Take is defined in regulations as pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect, or attempt to pursue, hunt, shoot, wound, kill, trap, capture, or collect. You see why I gave you this information in the notes. So what this is designed to do is to prevent people from having migratory birds as pets or injuring or killing them in any way, shape, or form. That is what this is designed to do. And, you know, when you get lawyers involved, you get all this legalese, because if you said sell, but you didn't say barter, somebody would barter for a bird and they, you know, try and work that loophole. So it's designed to protect migratory birds. There are exclusions, things that are not included in this. So those city pigeons, not protected under this act. Starlings, they're an invasive species. They're not native to the US. They are not protected. House sparrows, this is the most common sparrow species in the US. It's not native here. It's another invasive species, and it is also not protected. In addition, a bird inside a building you can catch it and release it outside. So there's not a law that says you can't get it back outside. And an injured bird, you're allowed to catch and transport to a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. If you want to do wildlife rehabilitation and you want to work with birds, you have to have a license. If you want to rehabilitate baby squirrels, depending on exactly where you live, you may or may not need any kind of permits. But for birds across the United States, you have to have a special permit for that. And I can hear somebody thinking, what about hunting? So there are some species that you can hunt, but they're specifically defined species. And you can only do this at certain times of the year. And you can only have a limited number of individuals. This is a lot like hunting mammals. If you hunt deer or moose, you're allowed so many individuals each season, and you're only allowed to hunt them at certain times of the year. Oh, I missed something in the chat. Would the Ipswich Wildlife Sanctuary be considered a rehabilitator? I'm trying to think, because I think there is an Ipswich River associated rehab, but there's also kind of a wildlife sanctuary that is just a protected wilderness. Faith, did you have something to chime in here?
Yes, so this is so when it comes to the limit of individuals, most states require you to tag an animal after killing it, and then you're only given a certain amount of tags per season, and then you have to cut those tags out to make sure that you don't take more than the limit for that season.
Good point. Thank you. I know not everybody knows much about hunting. A lot of what I know about hunting is from Northwood's Law. It's a TV show. But yeah, they give you some tags, and you have to tag the animals that you kill, and you physically cut those tags so you can show that you've used them, and you can't use them a second time that season. And a lot of animals have to be registered. You have to go and report that you've taken them. So, what kinds of birds can be hunted? Or are most likely to be hunted? Ducks, turkey, quail, and mourning doves, but not all species of duck. So there are lots of different species of duck, and each different species is going to have restrictions on whether you can hunt them and how many of them you can hunt. This is because some species of duck are in trouble and others are doing well. So you can take a lot of mallards like Sassy, but there are other species that you just can't take very many of because there just aren't very many of them. And at this point, I always want to mention an organization called Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited is an organization formed by duck hunters. And they formed this organization to ensure that there would be enough ducks for them to continue hunting. It is an amazing conservation group that has done amazing work. They help protect land that's important for ducks to breed and to feed. They fund research on ducks, and they've really helped to increase populations of most species of duck. So you don't think of hunters as helping out the animals that they hunt, but with Ducks Unlimited, they really are helping out ducks, and have really done a lot for wetland conservation in general. It's a good group. All right. So that's the hunting part. When you talk about eagles, there are special laws that apply. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act applies across the board. Eagles have additional laws that protect them. And in the US, this is bald eagles and golden eagles. So, in addition to any permits you might need under the Migratory Bird Act to have a migratory bird in your possession, live or taxidermied or hunted, you need a secondary permit, an additional permit. In order to handle injured eagles, keep non-releasable eagles in captivity, or even just have their feathers or bodies. These are very, very hard to get. So these permits tend to go to zoos for non-releasable animals. So if you go to zoos that have bald eagles, they'll often say, this eagle is blind, this one can't fly, that's why we have them. That's pretty much the only way zoos are allowed to have eagles, bald or golden eagles, the American eagles. For feathers or taxidermied specimens, you pretty much have to be a Native American. Feathers are used in some of their traditional ceremonies. And I'm spelling ceremony wrong. And so they can get special permits to have those feathers. In fact, if you find a dead bald or golden eagle, report it to Fish and Game. It's the bald and the golden eagles. Oh, there we go. Thank you. There is a federal repository for dead eagles. So the federal government will collect them and then distribute the feathers to Native Americans who need them for ceremonies. So eagles, really complicated. Even if you have, for example, a wildlife rehabilitation permit that allows you to do birds, you may not be allowed to do bald eagles and golden eagles. You're going to need another permit for those. Now, unfortunately, people constantly work around laws, so we have to have more than that. The Wild Bird Conservation Act. This is for birds that are not native to North America. This involves, it regulates importation of wild birds. So the average person is not really allowed to have a wild caught parrot as a pet or a wild caught cockatiel as a pet. The Wild Bird Conservation Act blocks that. Zoos and scientific researchers can get permits under the Wild Bird Conservation Act. So again, there can be permits for zoos and science. Before this act was passed, over 800,000 wild caught birds were imported to the US each year. Those are the ones that survived. Wild birds have a very, very high mortality when they're captured and transported for the pet trade. So the Wild Bird Conservation Act really wanted to squash that. And as I mentioned, there are always loopholes. Along comes the Lacey Act. The Wild Bird Conservation Act controls importation. The Lacey Act prohibits owning or trading wildlife that was illegally acquired. So somebody could smuggle a wild caught bird into the US, and before the Lacey Act, you could buy it from them and you wouldn't get in any trouble. The Lacey Act now says you're going to get in trouble. So if you have an endangered species that was brought into the country illegally, it's on you. And then there's CITES. CITES is something, if you deal with pets that are not dogs and cats, you need to be aware of this. This is an international treaty, and it protects rare and endangered species. So if we're talking about a bird that is listed as a rare or endangered species by CITES, that's a different permit. If you're getting the idea that if you want to have something really exotic, you need a whole stack of permits, yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a lot of regulations here. There are exceptions for captive raised individuals of some species, not all. So you can have a hyacinth macaw as a pet, even though they're endangered in the wild, if it was captive born and raised. CITES also regulates trade in parts of endangered species. Plants and animals. This is why you can't buy a rhino horn in the US, or elephant tusks, or ivory, which is made from elephant tusks. Okay, whew. So these are federal and international laws. There are also state and local regulations. So this is going to vary from state to state. You guys probably know that if you want something really rare as a pet, you can own it in New Hampshire, but you can't own it in Massachusetts. Those are the kinds of regulations we're talking about here. And if you rent, you need to check with your landlord first. Birds can be very, very noisy and destructive. If you're renting a place and the landlord knows anything about birds, they're going to tell you you can't have a cockatoo, for example, because they're just so destructive. And why do we have all of these laws? Because we need them. The pet trade takes huge numbers of animals out of the wild every year. The illegal pet trade is a multi-billion-dollar industry. So there are billions of dollars involved in illegally smuggling pets. And only about 1 in 6 birds that is smuggled survives. And those that survive are often sold online or at public auctions. Sometimes they do show up in pet stores. Usually not like the big chains, but smaller pet stores can sometimes do that. If you want a pet bird, know where it came from. Not just for legal reasons, not just because it's the right thing to do ethically, but also because if a bird was wild caught, it's not going to make as good of a pet, and it's probably not going to be as healthy. So get it from a breeder or a rescue group. In Massachusetts, the MSPCA is a good source for birds. They always have parakeets, finches, doves, and usually a couple of parrots or macaws. What are the fines like under these acts? Whew. Well, it depends on which act we're talking about, and how many they can pile on you, but they can certainly be thousands of dollars. And for some offenses, there can be jail time. All right. Oof. That was a lot of information. A lot of nitpicky details there. So that wraps up the legality part of birds. I'm not going to go on to the next topic because we're almost out of time. Does anybody have any questions or comments on any of this legal stuff? Okay. Lots of nopes going on. Well, in that case, we can call it a day. Oh, in the chat, Shannon wants to get a study group together. So if you're interested in joining that study group, her email is right there in the chat. That's a good idea. Thanks for organizing that, Shannon. Okay, next time we're going to start talking about the different groups of birds. And then if I remember right, we'll start anatomy. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye.